Most people know Montgomery as the beginning of something. A spark. A moment of spontaneous resistance that started a movement. That version is easier to remember, and it leaves out almost everything that made it work. Stride Toward Freedom, King's account of the boycott written in 1958, is not a story about patience. It is a detailed record of how organized, disciplined, nonviolent direct action was built from the ground up, and why King believed it was the only path that could actually work. The question it raises, 60 years later, is whether we ever learned what it was actually teaching. Montgomery, Alabama in 1955 was a city with a functioning apartheid system built into its daily infrastructure. Black residents made up roughly 75% of the city's bus ridership. They paid the same fares, sat in designated rear sections, and were required to give up those seats to white passengers when the front filled. The humiliation was routine and deliberate, a daily, enforced reminder of the social order the city intended to maintain. Rosa Parks' arrest on December 1, 1955 is remembered as a spontaneous act of individual defiance. It was not accidental. Parks was a trained organizer, secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, and had attended the Highlander Folk School, a training center for civil rights and labor organizers. The decision to use her arrest as the trigger for a boycott was made by people who had been watching for the right case and the right moment. 2 earlier arrests of black women on the same buses had been considered and passed over as organizing triggers for specific strategic reasons. What followed was not spontaneous either. Within hours of Parks' arrest, Joe and Robinson of the Women's Political Council had drafted and distributed a leaflet calling for a one-day bus boycott. The Black Church Network distributed the call across the community. The Montgomery Improvement Association was formed to coordinate the effort, and King, then 26 years old and new to the city, was elected its president. The infrastructure that made the boycott possible existed before the boycott began. Montgomery was not a spark. It was an ignition of something already built. King was explicit in Stride Toward Freedom about the choice black Americans faced in responding to oppression. He laid out 3 options and examined each on its own terms. The first was acquiescence, accepting the system, adapting to it, finding accommodation within it. King's rejection of this was not primarily moral. It was practical. A system that faces no resistance has no reason to change. Acquiescence, in his argument, produced exactly the stability it appeared to offer, permanently, at the cost of justice. The second was violent resistance. King understood its appeal. The anger that produced it was legitimate. His argument against it was strategic rather than absolute. Violence by the oppressed against a vastly more powerful opponent invites retaliation that destroys the movement and alienates the broader support it requires. It also, he argued, corrodes the discipline that organized resistance depends on. The third path, nonviolent direct action, was not a compromise between the other two. It was a distinct method with its own demands. It required refusing to accept the system while refusing to meet its violence with violence. It required sustained discipline under pressure that was specifically designed to break that discipline. King was clear that this was the most difficult of the 3 paths, not the easiest. That framework did not stay in 1955. The debate King described, between accommodation, violent response, and organized nonviolent resistance, is the same debate that surfaces every time protest meets institutional force. It was present in the discussions around Black Lives Matter responses to police violence. It was present in debates around ICE enforcement protests. The tactical question King answered in Montgomery is still being answered, in real time, by people facing structurally similar choices. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. That duration was not the result of spontaneous collective will sustaining itself, it was the result of infrastructure. King's account in Stride Toward Freedom is specific about what that infrastructure was and what it required. The Black Church was the organizational backbone. It provided meeting spaces, communication networks, and the existing relationships of trust that allowed coordination at scale without formal institutional support. The weekly mass meetings at the churches sustained morale and maintained transparency about the boycott's direction. King was explicit that the community needed to understand what was being decided and why. The practical problem of transportation was solved through a coordinated carpool system, eventually running over 300 vehicles, organized by the Montgomery Improvement Association. When the city attempted to shut the carpool down through legal pressure, the community was already in the process of purchasing additional vehicles through church donations. Economic pressure was the mechanism. Black ridership was the bus system's financial base. Removing it made the cost of maintaining segregation on the buses a concrete budget problem rather than an abstract moral one. The boycott did not ask the city to be just. It made injustice expensive. The discipline required to sustain that for over a year, in the face of bombings, arrests, and sustained legal harassment, is the part the spontaneous spark version of Montgomery erases. It also erases what the organizing model demonstrated, that sustained, coordinated community action could move an institution that had no intention of moving. The Black Lives Matter movement that emerged after 2013 carried forward parts of this model and departed from others. The decentralized structure BLM adopted, deliberately leaderless in ways the MIA was not, reflected lessons learned from how movements are dismantled when their leadership is targeted. The economic pressure mechanism reappeared in calls for divestment and targeted boycotts. The debate about discipline and tactics that King addressed in Stride Toward Freedom reappeared in arguments about property destruction and police response at protests across the country. The organizing questions Montgomery raised did not get resolved. They got inherited. King's conclusions from Montgomery were specific. Organized, nonviolent direct action worked, not because it appealed to the conscience of the opponent, but because it applied pressure the opponent had to respond to. The model required community infrastructure, economic leverage, tactical discipline, and the capacity to sustain pressure long enough to make the cost of resistance higher than the cost of change. He was also specific about what the model required from the broader public. Montgomery drew support from people whose direct stake in bus segregation was limited: white allies, Northern supporters, labor organizers. The organizing model worked in part because the specific injustice being targeted had legible overlap with the interests of people not directly subject to it. That overlap was not incidental. It was part of how organized action builds the scale required to move institutions. That observation, that movements gain force when people recognize shared stakes across different experiences of the same system, is the thread that runs from Montgomery through every subsequent organizing effort that drew on its model. It does not require identical experience. It requires enough overlap to produce common cause. Stride Toward Freedom was published in 1958, 3 years after the boycott ended and 7 years before the legislative peak of the civil rights movement. King wrote it as a record of method, not just history. The roadmap he described was specific, replicable, and grounded in what had actually worked. The question the book leaves open is not whether the method was sound. The record on that is clear. The question is what it would take to use it. The organizing model King built in Montgomery did not emerge from strategy alone. It was rooted in a set of convictions about justice, courage, and what it means to respond to hatred without becoming it. Those convictions are what King wrote about next. In the next video in this series, we go into Strength of Love, the collection that reveals the philosophical and moral foundation beneath everything Montgomery built, and what King believed it cost a person to act on those principles consistently. That foundation is worth understanding on its own terms.